I was having probably some calming training, maybe C4, and which for those that don't know is just a place to put an electrode and then help the brain to calm its arousal. And I probably went into the session, I was ruminating about something. I have no idea what it was. Usually ruminations are not that important. But I was like, in my mind. And then all of a sudden, the conversation was gone. And the emotion that went with the conversation was gone. And it was like someone had just flipped a switch in my nervous system. And I was so startled. And I looked at 𝙬𝗓𝙚 and I said, what did you just do with my emotion? Because it was like it was there and then it wasn't there. And she was the only other person in the room, and I hadn't done anything, So these very basic experiences that people have are what it means to be entering to this new paradigm.
The Neurofeed podcast. How is clinical neurofeedback transforming lives? We talk with therapists, researchers, and home users. From the intersection of neuroscience and therapy, these interviews tell stories of discovery, empowerment, and learning to thrive. Our guest today is Ellen Shaw-Smith, LICSW, board certified in neurofeedback and certified in dialectical behavioral therapy with an emphasis on the importance of early attachment and a focus on early and ongoing trauma. Ellen is in private practice in Massachusetts. Since her first introductory course in 2002, she's been passionately committed to understanding the brain's language of intelligent electrical communication, recognizing that this communication, when respectfully harnessed, supports deep change in the brain and body of each person accessing neurofeedback training. Having mentored extensively with neurofeedback trauma expert Siebert Fisher and neuropsychologist Dr. Ed Hamlin, Ellen continues to teach and mentor on beginning and advanced neurofeedback topics. So, welcome, Ellen. I'm so glad that you could come today. I'm really excited about this conversation today. And I wonder if maybe we could just kick it off with some pretty basic kind of stuff. When you first start interacting with a new client, how do you describe neurofeedback to them? How do you talk about it?
I'm laughing because I went through the question. Lars was kind enough to send me some questions to organize my thinking. So my mind was on the beginning of those. And so he's like gone so far forward in time now that I've got to do this adjustment.
Sorry.
I tend to go, I do a psycho-ed course, which is about how to talk to the right brain side of people so they really understand what neurofeedback is. And we all know if we're providers that people call and they may be thinking that they're calling about something completely different than what it actually is. So they may know nothing, or they may know quite a bit, and it might be very scientific kind of understanding. So I do try to meet people where they are, but I really lean into trying to figure out how to use metaphors so that people can quickly grasp, because if they decide to do this with me, that's how we're going to have to figure out the conversation. Like, we're going to have to find kind of a vernacular conversation where we both really understand what we're talking about. So a couple basic things is that I talk about that neurofeedback is working with the electrical communication in the brain and the nervous system. And that most of us in our culture, our paradigm is around the chemical interactions in the body and how that really runs everything. And so that this is a different paradigm. And then I use kind of simplistic metaphors sometimes, although I'm careful not to, if someone has a very scientific view of what this is, I don't want to make it sound too informal. But I talk about, when we're working with the brain, that all the different areas of the brain have very specific functions that they're in charge of. And that those areas of the brain need to have this electrical communication going on in an optimal way for that area to be able to do its function. And then all the areas of the brain need to speak to each other as if they're on a team, and that this electrical communication conversation is what allows that to happen, and that's really what we're going to do. So I may make it a little more sophisticated, but I really just make it very basic, and then we kind of build from there, because I want to see if I can hear the person on the other end of the phone. If we see somebody face to face, we can kind of see when their eyes glaze over and they don't know what we're talking about. On the phone, I just want to hear some response from them, that they're like, oh, wow, that's a new thought, And so I really tend to just be pretty easy with just trying to explain a basic concept.
Ellen, I took your course that you do on psychoeducation, and there's just so many fabulous nuggets in there. How to explain this to clients, how to help them understand the process. I was curious if anything stands out to you about, some of the things that you find most challenging to help clients understand about the neurofeedback or the process.
Most is like, there's a number of things. I think maybe I'm so basic when I start talking to people, because what I know and my own experience of training is that even that people may do this quite a while before they actually really understand what they're doing. And if they come to do neurofeedback with me and we have some goals and we've done an assessment and we're doing the training and we're having conversations, because I'm very vigilant about getting a report after every session, it's not uncommon sometimes to be doing this with someone for a while and realize that we're actually not in a shared conversation yet about what we're doing, So I'm kind of leaving these little breadcrumb trail about, so the reason that I'm kind of basic about what I talk about what this is, and then I give people information if they need something more specific, is then once they actually have an experience of neurofeedback, and then they're going to pay attention to what they noticed from that, and then they're going to figure out how to tell me what they noticed. And this is a conversation that really needs to build. And so because I know sort of a lot of things as the expert in some of this, I can be going along and I'm like, we're talking this, and then all of a sudden I realize they don't understand. They haven't been understanding this thing that I've been saying, and I've been hearing them say something, but I haven't really understood it. So I'm so used to that happening, Leanne, that I just kind of assume that I just have to keep making my conversation basic and that it's going to build over time. But what's happening is not basic, Leanne. So even though I may default to this kind of conversation so that I'm pretty vigilant, are we really talking about the same thing here? Let me give you an example. This is kind of where I thought Lars was going to start out. So I have a trauma history, and I was looking for some treatment that was not talking. And this was 20 plus years ago. And I looked at some different things, and a neurofeedback provider was kind enough to call me and spend 20 minutes on the phone with me explaining this whole idea of neuronal activity and brain firing and everything. So clearly she was having quite a sophisticated conversation with me. But I was like, oh my God, that's the missing link. And I knew I wanted to do it. And so I didn't end up working with her. 𝘲𝗏 Fisher was the first person that trained me. So how lucky was that, And so, but one of my early experiences just changed my whole idea of what this is, because I was having probably some calming training, maybe C4, and which for those that don't know is just a place to put an electrode and then help the brain to calm its arousal. And I probably went into the session, I was ruminating about something. I have no idea what it was. Usually ruminations are not that important. But I was in my mind. And then all of a sudden, the conversation was gone, and the emotion that went with the conversation was gone. And it was like someone had just flipped a switch in my nervous system, and I was so startled. And I looked at 𝘲𝗏 and I said, what did you just do with my emotion? Because it was like it was there, and then it wasn't there. And she was the only other person in the room, and I hadn't done anything, So these very basic experiences that people have are what it means to be entering to this new paradigm. And so that's why I assume that even though I'm trying to have a somewhat basic conversation with people until I'm really sure we're talking the same talk, I know that the experience they're having is not basic, and it's not going to be necessarily familiar to them. And so while I'm trying to create this shared conversation so that we can really track this together, and how people figure out to even talk about what they're experiencing, because if I had gone out of the office, done training, a half hour later that happened, I would not have associated it with the neurofeedback. I would have associated it with something else, and I may not have even told my provider about it, So even though I try to make this conversation very solid and basic, until I'm really clear that we're in the same conversation, I do not assume that from the very first time someone does a training that their experience is going to be something that's basic. I think it's often kind of transformational for people, like it was for me that day. And after that, I spent about 6 months just walking through my days, looking at people, and just having this question that wouldn't leave me alone, is that I would think, well, I wonder what it's like to be in that brain. I wonder what it's like to be in that brain and that brain. And I just couldn't see us as human beings in the same way anymore after that. So I make an assumption that people, it might be slow, it might be fast, that people are going to have these changes that they're not necessarily going to know how to notice or talk about. And so for me, it's just to create this solid ground. Making this shared conversation the priority is how I do it. So.
And I think you do that in probably one of the best in the industry, if not the best, in really, truly, deeply listening to people and hearing them and trying to sort of climb into their experience.
Yeah. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you.
I think that's one of the things that really stood out to me when you presented at our little mini retreat about the client, which I won't go into client details here. But what stood out to me is the slow but purposeful, methodic way that you approach neurofeedback. And how beautiful that is. There's no rush, there's no hurry. It's at the person's pace, and it's really about giving them an experience that is transformative and healing. And that has stuck with me since your presentation.
Thank you, Leanne. It's nice that you're mentioning that, because I'll say that the case study, and I'll be doing that in my next eager mentoring course, so that, Lars, you'll get to be privy to this. I do that. I'm very methodical about really tracking exactly what we've done with the neurofeedback, exactly how someone has responded. How does that match their goals? How do I know I'm helping to keep them safe and healthy on this journey? But I will say that the case study that you're referring to, Leanne, was with someone who had been severely traumatized. And it was a window into 10 months of work where this person went forward like she was on a high-speed train. Like it was very, very fast and deep change.
And it's very small amounts of training.
Yes. And it was an important one to give, because it just really highlights how neurofeedback can really support changes that people have not been able to access, in other ways. So even though I'm in this very basic, methodical conversation, the changes that she was on a high rail monorail, journey. And so to hold that and make sense of it and keep it grounded, So, and then it's just as good if someone comes in and has a slow change. In fact, sometimes I trust that even more. Or they just have a small goal. The one thing I will say, though, Leanne, and I think that people can't understand this unless they experience neurofeedback, is that sometimes when we read about it or people talk about it, they kind of assume that, like, say you want to increase your attentional capacity. So you put an electrode on the head, a sensor, and you do a training. There's sort of this assumption that the only thing that's going to change is the thing that we were intending to have change. So maybe someone will be better at doing their taxes. But that's not actually how this works, because the whole nervous system, I don't know if it's right to say it gets a tune-up, because that's sort of a mechanistic view. And our nervous systems are three-dimensional, five-dimensional. I don't even know. There's so much going on. So we would say that if we help some area to improve functioning, improve stability or flexibility, the whole nervous system is involved in what we did. And so the one thing, that I would slide in there is that, it's really a whole body, and it's a whole body I kind of hate to call it an intervention because we're so reflecting the body's own activity back to itself that it's kind of a call and response dance. It's not like we decide this is what we want the body to do now and then we make it do it. It's not that. But it's a whole body engagement when you do neurofeedback. And so a person is going to, if the process is held properly, they're going to feel different and more themselves and more functional in different ways. So maybe their attention gets better, but they just are more patient caught in traffic. And so then when they get home and dinner is late, they're more pleasant with the people around them. I mean, it really is that it enhances our nervous system. And that's usually not something that people expect.
Yeah. I would back up a little bit. Well, just I'm wondering from the perspective, because part of the purpose of this podcast really is to draw people into what is the process of becoming a neurotherapist, right? Of how to do clinical feedback. So I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit about when you were first starting to do the practicing part, not as a person who's training, but as the person who's deciding what protocols to use. What were some of those? Do you recall the things that were challenging to you? Like what was counterintuitive in that process, and what was really challenging for you to learn and get used to?
So I wrote down about that. So let me shift my gears because I think I know the answer. But for me, what was counterintuitive was that I was going to work with computers in a technical way. And truthfully, I'm about 21 years into being a neurofeedback provider. And I would say the first 10 to 12 years, I would just think this has got to be how did I even get here? This has got to be this. What am I doing in this field? And sometimes I would whisper, I don't really like computers, but I didn't want my neurofeedback system to hear me say that. And of course, I'm one of those people, if I buy a microwave, I just want to know exactly what I need to do with it to heat the water and do the things I want to do. And I don't really need to, because I'm a right brain, intuitive person, So for one thing, for many years, I thought that I must have stumbled through the wrong door. And then this is what Leanne and both of you are kind of asking me. Then I realized that's absolutely untrue, that this is a powerful technology that mirrors the entire nervous system of a human being who's engaged in it. And we absolutely need people. And some people have good right and left brain capacities like Leanne. And so they can do a lot of technical stuff fairly easily, but really be present with the person. I have to learn the technical stuff. I tend to only learn what I need to. And so when I teach, I help people. And if I don't know something, I'll go find it out from someone else. I just want to know what I absolutely need to know so that I can do the very best to help someone's nervous system and their being come online. So that was the hardest thing for me, was to accept that I was in a technical field working with computers. Yeah.
And I know, Ellen, part of what you've been open about is that you did more than one intro training to try to help with learning, all the technical pieces. I hope it's okay I shared that because it is helpful for beginners to know that we all have to go about this in our own ways. There's not a 4-day crash course is not everyone's easiest way to learn.
Right. And I think that we still are, we refine every day. I mean, the teachers are constantly trying to figure out, in grad school, I had a professor say that we were only going to need 50% of what he was teaching us. And if he knew which 50% that was, then he would cut out the rest, but we don't know that. And in this complex world where neurofeedback is taught and provided in different ways with different systems and sometimes different philosophies, and some people have a different idea about its application, there's a way that we need to teach it so that it's adequate to whatever approach someone's going to follow. And yet it still doesn't get such a busy kind of trying to teach a million things, So we're always trying to do that. And so when I went to a course, we don't do this anymore. It's been many years, but there are 19 sites on the head that if you do a brain recording, you can track 19 sites. And there are 19 sites. There are more than 19 sites where we can put a sensor. But the first 4-day course I went to, they taught us the whole 19 sites in 4 days. We had to do a long assessment on ourselves and our partner. And then we had to figure out where of these 19 sites we were going to put an electrode, and we had to train each other. And, and now we teach what, like 4 sites? Leanne, you're the practicum teacher. How many sites do you teach now?
So we teach FC, CZ, PZ, and then C3, C4. So 5 sites. That's it.
So 19 down to 5. So is it a wonder that I went back the next year to do it again? And then 3 or 4 years later, I was like, well, I have my habits now, and I'm starting to get this. And I went back again because I was like, so I wanted to make sure those habits were ones that I still had clear and I hadn't slid into. And in that process, they were kind of bringing down to size what they were teaching. And so I watched the evolution of that. And then I was involved in doing practicums and trainings with Ed Hamlin for some time. And so, and then I also, from early on, started going to, so at 𝘁𝗿𝗏 had a consultation group that I went to, but there was a consultation group near Boston where I started going almost right away because different people were there with different systems that worked in different ways. And I seemed to want to know right from the beginning some kind of conversation in my head about how all these cross directions, like how they fit together and what, because I knew my brain actually benefited from training in different ways with different people. So this educational path for me has always been part of my passion. And now at, 20 plus years, like I'm really working with other providers and with Eager to distill this down. So like, what are the basic things? Like forget about 80% of what you might have read. Like when you're starting, these are the 5 things and you'll be fine and you'll be able to help people if you just look at these 5 things, because people's heads can kind of explode sometimes on this path of learning and they don't know how to be responsible in the beginning, like what's the most important thing to listen to. So I find that really fascinating to like really hone in on that and be able to teach that way. And then help people advance, as they need to for their patients or as their natural tendency to advance. So Lars, did that kind of answer your question?
Good. Yeah, that's great. It sounds like you're talking about really simplifying the approach so that people can really grasp it and find it useful for their day-to-day practice.
Yeah.
I wonder so you were doing therapy before you began to do neurofeedback, am I right?
Yes.
And I wondered what change happened in your practice once you began using neurofeedback? Did everything change? Did some part of it change? Were you surprised by any bit of what happened as you began to work in the sort of oscillatory nature of people's nervous systems?
Well, I'll talk to the practical parts of that and then the more kind of interesting, slightly more esoteric parts. So I was subletting, I was working in an agency for many years. I taught psychoeducation, which is sort of part of my love of education that now comes into teaching neurofeedback. So I was lucky I had that, but I was in an agency and then I sublet from someone and I was building a small private practice. When I got my own system, all bets were off. I couldn't put that in someone else's office. So I was like forced to rent my first space and then figure out how to support that and still work at these are the practicalities. And I had never really done billing either. And then I'm learning neurofeedback. So the first thing I decided I was going to hire someone to do my billing because there was no way that I could learn all these things. I had an office for a year that was sort of okay to start, but didn't work out well. So then I had to so you go into this business transformation when you are in this field, and it can sometimes, say someone else was already in private practice, already doing their own billing, they wouldn't have been in the situation I was in. So it can look different for different people. But there are moments where you just have to kind of make your decisions of how to simplify the process so you can go on to the next step, and also how you can afford to do the steps. Like at a certain point in the beginning, I didn't charge for the neurofeedback and I couldn't really bill for it. And then I think I charged like $20 or $25. So, and then as I invested more, learned more, went to more trainings, what happened for me was there was a point on a practical level that I needed to be doing neurofeedback with everyone that I was seeing, because I couldn't stay in this middle lane. There wasn't a middle lane for practical reasons, that just to be able to support my practice financially, to be able to get good enough at what I wanted to do. So there are all these transition points that people go through, and it's important to have other clinicians to talk about. I think the biggest thing that happened along the way with that, and then of course in the beginning I was like so scared about doing something with people's brains, so that and then learning the technical stuff. And I can actually remember crying on the phone, and I want people to hear this. One of my 4-day teachers told a great story, 𝙏𝙃𝗵𝗏𝗧. He said he left his neurofeedback system in the box for like 6 months when he first got it because he was so nervous about pulling it out. He's an amazing provider, and he told that story. Like many of us are sort of wondering, what have we got ourselves into? But about 6 months in, I just remember having these tech issues. I couldn't figure out what was going on and crying on the phone and just saying, if we can't figure this out, I'm done, And so you have these moments, and yet here I am 20 years later with no regrets and so much gratitude, like for Igor and the other clinicians that helped me get through those periods. And so I think the biggest change outside of needing to walk the practical realities of trying to build a practice is that after a while, the changes that you see when you're doing therapy with the people that are doing neurofeedback are so different that it's like you just don't, it's hard to be engaged in the same way when you're not doing it with people because their progress is so much slower. It's hard. I mean, once you know how to deliver neurofeedback, it's hard to feel ethically almost like that you're not doing that with people because you know the level of change they can have. And it also, it can be a little hard to stay engaged in a very, what feels kind of a pedestrian process of just doing talk therapy with people. And I don't mean to, demean any talk therapy work. I'm just saying that when you bring talk therapy together with neurofeedback, you've got a whole different thing going on. Yeah.
That's great. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what those, because I'm thinking from the perspective of somebody who does therapy or counseling or any of those kinds of things, trying to like sort of visualize how that's going to be different. I've heard other clinicians say, for example, that one of the things about neurofeedback outcomes is that they happen more quickly. They don't happen fast, but they happen more quickly. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how have your expectations for what you're looking at, even with somebody with a really devastating history, how that's shifted?
Well, if someone has a really difficult history, I almost want to slow it down because fast change can be too much. But I think, it takes me to the way that I've organized how I track. So when we do an assessment, there's some basic decisions that we have to make about where are we going to place that first sensor and what's the goal going to be. And so my very first basic question is, am I going to help lower someone's arousal, help them be calmer? Am I going to help increase it so they might be able to focus better? Or am I going to help stabilize that arousal? So that's like the very first question. And it's a basic question, and we do a long assessment. And so when people are just learning, they can look at this, 10-page assessment and think, like, I don't even know what to do with this. But the reality is you only need to do that one thing with it. You're just deciding lower arousal, increase arousal, or stabilize arousal. So there really is a way to make sense of all this. And then once someone does that first training, then it really is like watching them, listening to them, and helping them tell you what happened, what the change is. And Lars, could you repeat the question? Because I know I'm answering it, but I've sort of lost my thread.
Yeah, no, you're definitely answering it. What I was thinking about was from the perspective of somebody who's really either just getting started or considering getting started doing this, what can, how are my expectations going to change as a clinician? How is that whole process of really the way I think of
Helping
it?
people?
No. What's that?
I said helping people. How's the process of helping them change?
Yeah, I guess, one of the things that sticks in my mind is the way that I've heard from other clinicians that it has to do with helping someone. And you kind of alluded to this here, is that if somebody is coming from a long period of protecting themselves and a lot of threat response and hypervigilance and so on, then really slowing that process down, because it can feel like an enormous risk to suddenly feel like where's my fear? I was really relying on my fear. So I wonder if you can kind of help us to understand what that looks like in the
Yes.
process.
Yes. And as you do that, because there's probably 3 different answers I could give you, right? And I want to do the one that's most useful. But I just want to say that that's the important question, what you just said. It's the key question that we're all, even if we've been doing this a long time, if we want to talk to a colleague about what's going on, that is the question that we're talking about, right? And with neurofeedback, in any way that I believe in it being practiced, we use our person as part of this journey. Because you can imagine if someone's driving an old car and then you fix it up, you help them fix it up, or you give them a better car and you put them in it. It doesn't mean that they feel comfortable in that car or they know what to do with it, or, and that's kind of a crude metaphor. But so what I explained about deciding where you're going to put the first sensor and then really paying attention to how the person experiences the change and how they learn to talk to you about it and teaching them about that is so important to exactly the question you're asking, because the first thing I'm listening to is, what am I hearing about this person's brain and how it's, how it's liking, not liking, how it's trying to make sense of, and how is the person making sense? Like I had that experience with Sebring, like, what did you do with my emotion? But it was big enough that after that, I wondered about what it was like to be in someone else's brain. Like I just knew that we were not, as humans, quite what I thought we were. Like we were something even more amazing than I already thought. So when I say that I do these very basic things in a certain way in the beginning, it's because I want the answer to your question, Lars. And so what I do is, when we work with the arousal model, we're going to track certain things, changes, so that we know how that neurofeedback session affected that person's nervous system. But for me, I put all that tracking into categories that will cover pretty much the whole experience that anybody could have. So I'm going to look for their physiological markers of change, like that are in their body. It could be, how did they sleep? What did they want to eat? And then I'm going to look for their interpersonal changes. And people don't think about this. If they wanted to improve their intention, they're not going to tell you that suddenly everyone's smiling at them and they don't know why. But interpersonally, like, they're moving around differently. I'm going to look for their feelings about how their moods are changing and how they're looking at themselves. How are they talking to me about who they are? Like, they came in, they were down on themselves, and suddenly they're like happy that they succeed. And then I'm going to also, I'm going to look at attentionally and focus, like how are they doing with their tasks and the things that they feel they need to accomplish, which affects the quality of all of our lives. So Lars, your answer, the best answer I can give you is that I'm going to pay attention in an organized, simplified way to all of this. And each person in each person's nervous system and person is going to tell me in all those categories, like, what's happening with them. And then I'm going to meet them right there. And so what that actually means is that they're going to move forward in some way, probably pretty quickly. In other ways, maybe not so much. And we'll have to figure out together, like, how to change things. And if they're stuck somewhere, I'm going to see that pretty quickly. And I'm going to be strategizing, because I know that as I've watched people unfold in a certain way from neurofeedback, I'm going to notice this thing isn't happening for them yet. And in fact, they don't even know that something like this could happen for them. So, for instance, if they came in to improve their focus, they don't even know what it would be like to walk around in a world where everyone's smiling at them. And I might not even start a conversation about that, because they might tell me, like, what are you talking about? That's not why I'm here. But I know that. And so I'm going to be watching for that. So some people just start to, like, they just start to bound forward, and all of a sudden, like, they're talking to me about something, and I'm like, oh, we're going to have to work on this for a long time. And they come in and, like, they've left me in the dust, And then someone else, I'm like thinking, wow, they really need this part of their life to move, and it's not moving. And so I'm gonna start to suggest to them that maybe there's something, and maybe we'll put the sensor somewhere else. So, but it is this faster trajectory, but it looks different for everybody, But I know exactly what I'm watching for in these different areas that are going to make people's quality of life go up and their happiness and their functionality. And I'm going to be with them in that, if it's moving or not moving, if they've gone way forward or if they're stuck. That's just where I am with them. And it's so much fun. It's just a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you.
Did that kind of answer? I can't tell because these are such big questions. It's a vast conversation. So,
Ellen, as you were saying all that, I was thinking about what therapy looked like before I started neurofeedback and how that probably sounds so different to those listening who don't use neurofeedback already. But this process just probably sounds like, oh, okay, that's going to be a different version of a session than I'm used to. And then you get doing it, and you're like, oh man, this is such a better way to really hear people and be with people. And I often will say that the beauty of neurofeedback is for those who really struggle to share their story. When you do the neurofeedback, that happens more readily. And people will understand your story more easily and be able to hear how you're feeling. And so many of the processes that are hard in therapy, as all of that is transforming, what we love doing in therapy of hearing and supporting people is so much more possible with the neurofeedback. So it's still different for every person, but there's so much more that we want to do that we're able to do when we're doing the neurofeedback.
yes.
And it really supports it in that way.
Yes. And my neurofeedback educator hat is like, on my head, it's like making noises. It's because, Leanne, it's like what we were talking about, this electrical communication. So if someone has a memory or they've been impacted by a difficult experience, it's in their body and it's affecting them, but they might not be able to tell their story even to themselves. They might not have a clear memory. They might not have words. So that's stored or held in a certain area of the brain. But suddenly, if we've helped the communication to happen from that experience where that's held, or the functionality of that to communicate with the part of the brain where they can put words to it. So that's very practical what we're talking about. It's not a mystery. Like, this part of the brain can talk to that part of the brain, and suddenly there are words, and then you can say them to your neurofeedback therapist who's on the other side, like just waiting. It's almost like sometimes I feel like a midwife. Like I'm just waiting for the next part of the person that's going to come online and come and make visible to me. And then I'm right there to meet that. Because sometimes it comes awkwardly, or people are like, what is this? Or I've never felt this before. Or sometimes people are just happy. And a lot of times people actually don't notice it because it feels so natural that they kind of lose track that it wasn't always like that. And then it's our job to say to them, do you know what just happened, So we get to just kind of be this wraparound person who's helping this to change to happen in someone's nervous system, and then being there to meet them.
Love that the way you're describing is really being a guide for someone in their process and really empowering them to find their own path. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you've talked in some of our webinars about the importance of tracking people in their process and in their progress. And I've heard from you and others that part of the reflection that's happening there, both in the neurofeedback itself and also in the therapeutic process, is about raising the person's awareness about what they're experiencing. I wonder if you could talk about how that interplay between helping to track and then reflecting back to somebody, so that it builds their sense of awareness of what's happening for them.
Yeah. It's a multifaceted process, Lars, because say someone comes in and you do an assessment with them and it's clear, and maybe they're having a physical ailment that has an element of pain to it, but they're not registering that pain consciously. Or emotional pain. They've had things happen and they say, that didn't bother me. But it's intruding on their life and their beingness, their development. So when you're a neurofeedback therapist, you're listening not just to the person, you're listening to their brain. And we're not orienting towards a psychological assessment of why they're, I mean, that may lend itself to our understanding, but we're thinking their brain isn't online in this for this certain capacity. So we don't actually have to spend a lot of time trying to encourage somebody to try to do something that they can't do, which unfortunately a lot of therapy has to do that, right? And then they get frustrated with us, or they feel ashamed, or they don't know what we're talking about, and we get tired and frustrated with them because they're not listening, you know, all those loops that happen. It's like, so where do we train so that very gently they begin to feel? And sometimes then we're not even the first person that brings it up. All of a sudden they're saying, they just come in and they're saying things about something they couldn't even register before. Or it's often a back and forth where I might say to them, do you realize that, you know, you talked about this really difficult thing that happened, but there was no emotion in your voice. Could it be that it's hard for you to register that? How shall, you know, let's talk about how we might use neurofeedback. Would you like to do that? Because changes can be welcome, and then they also can be challenging. And so the conversation does need to hold it there. But I will tell people that I work with that I'm always listening to at least 2 conversations when they're talking to me. And sometimes I'll just stop completely what they're saying, because for 2 reasons. One is because I want them to hear these 2 things also. I want them to be listening to what they're saying about their brain. And I'm not doing that all the time. You know, people just need to talk. But the other is that sometimes I know that I'm listening so hard to these 2 conversations that if I don't tell someone I'm doing that, they're going to think that I'm not paying attention to them, because they can tell that I'm thinking about something. So I will sometimes stop people and I'll say, you know, I just want you to know that right now I'm hearing what you said, and I might repeat it back to them. And then I'll say, and I'm really listening for just this moment about what I think that might be saying about how your brain is working, and, you know, how it's doing what you need it to, and how we can help it. And then I'll tell them that, and then I will repeat back to them, and I know this was important to you, what you were telling me, because, you know, so, but you're almost always listening to, you become, I tried to write it down. What is it? You know, when you say, well, you're bilingual, well, we become bi-listeners or something. I don't know what the right term would be, but we have to be listening to the brain all the time. And we're making our decisions about how much of that we share with a person in the moment, how much we might wait and talk to them about it later. It becomes part of the strategy. But it's just something that we're doing all the time with people. And so then you sort of gently guide people along at the pace. And sometimes people it'll be like, well, I thought you would never ask, like, that I want this. And sometimes there are people like, no, I don't think I'm not ready for that. So, you know, we'll walk through this together.
I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by the 2 conversations that are the 2 things that are happening at once. What I heard was that one of them is the subject, the matter that somebody is actually saying, the content of what they're saying and the other is the implications for how their brain, how their nervous system, what this means for them in terms of their, okay, all right. Just want to.
You know, Lars, that can be a challenge sometimes as a provider, because we spend a long time learning psychological orientation and solutions, or if maybe we're working interpersonally with somebody, or we're trying to help them with their sense of self, or, you know, so we already have multiple conversations. And then suddenly there's this other big one that plops down right in the middle of it that you cannot ignore if you want to do this work, which is, so what's going on underneath all that? You know, which is why we can help people make these faster changes. But it takes a while as a provider to not keep defaulting to the more psychological, which is on top of the, you know, the nervous system. And so, as Sebring would say, you can't ride 2 horses. So you're going to have to decide at some point what you think the more basic mechanisms are. And so I talk to people about that sometimes, and I'll tell them, like, these dual conversations that I'm listening to in my head.
It almost sounds like, you know, there's your first language, like English is my first language, and or in professionally, psychology, you know, attachment language, your internal family systems, those are all different languages, and attachment's my first language. And since learning neurofeedback, I've had to learn to translate everything that I'm hearing from people into arousal model, into attuned neurofeedback. And so there's always these different languages in your head of the different theories you work within. But it is hard. You can't translate 5 languages in your head at the same time. You kind of have to know which one is the most important for you.
And, if you do this for a while, and, I'm just really starting to go to the bottom line almost all the time now, because I would find myself in this psychological frame. And then I'm working with someone over a period of time. And then I think, darn, why didn't I remember that we could train for that? And I could help them in this more basic way. And then I can be there to help them with the psychological and the interpersonal and the coaching, as this all comes online for them. So there is a period of adjustment. And sometimes still after many years, I'm like, why didn't I think about that?
Why am I still speaking Spanish? I could speak French to them.
Right. So I think that's okay, because we wear different hats and it's the way it is. But yeah.
The thing that I've been saying to my tech is, it's a sort of a joke, but it's an exaggeration of the truth, is that doing therapy with neurofeedback is so become my way of doing it that if I think about having to do it without it, I'm like, why would I want to do therapy with my hands tied behind my back? It's just so much more to think in the attuned neurofeedback, the arousal model, to approach it from that direction. I get the other stuff too, but it really makes such a difference in the work to be able to incorporate the neurofeedback.
Yes.
Recently, 𝙗𝘂𝑃𝑒𝑟 was talking about how her sense is that attachment rupture is really, for really the culture at large is becoming known as one of the core things. And what was interesting to hear her talk about this, this was in a conversation about deep brain reorienting. It really made me think about how important, particularly for eager clinicians, approaching the process of neurofeedback, it includes this, the therapeutic alliance, the importance of the transference of a therapeutic relationship with a person, so that in a way, if it seems to me like the person who is coming for training can practice being in a healthy relationship with someone, and that their system can start to become used to that as a method. I wonder if maybe you could talk about the role that plays, the importance of that in your own work.
Well, I started out with 𝙗𝘂𝑃𝑒𝑟, and I have a trauma history, so she was a good person for me to begin with. But, we now use the term, many of us, there's a model called attuned neurofeedback, which is really just predicated on exactly what you're saying, Lars, because I think whether you have a trauma history or not, this relational reflection, and so I think of it a little bit very much like what you said, but slightly differently. For me, it's an organic experience of two people in relationship that are focused on agreeing on a certain task. And so it's if someone awareness of about what it actually feels like in their body, or what it's like to experience an emotion that's been too big to experience, or now they can finally do some task that they pass their GREs or something, and now they're this person that they couldn't be before. Like suddenly they are, and I'm the person there with them. And so we are in a real relationship, that's committed on this, the work we're doing together within the ethical guidance but it's not a strategy that we are two human beings that are in this experience of really working with the nervous system and both advocating and supporting a level of change in a certain way that I don't think has been available to us before this. So, it's a profound experience to work together in this way. And in that sense, it's an organic, real reflection of two people working together and in our basic human development, our humanity as people, in service of these very important goals that each of us have, And I've trained with so many different providers myself. I've been the person who is dependent on somebody helping to find the right protocol for me and then being there with me as I begin to experience the changes, So I feel very humble about this. I'm not trying to be arrogant about it at all. But it's something in us as human beings and our body comes online. That's a very kind of profound experience. And the person who's there with us, who's dedicated to our well-being in that regard, it's a really significant agreement to work together and be together in that way. And so being together in that way to generate these really healthy and important changes then ripples out into other relationships and a person's sense of who they are in the world and what they can accomplish. And a lot of times it remediates experiences they may have had earlier that didn't leave them feeling respected or successful or, So to me, it's like this very real exchange that we're in with the people that we work with. And it's just a profound privilege to be in that.
What I love about what you're saying, Ellen, is there's a real genuineness. It's not a technique. It's not a put on. It's not a thing we're doing in the room. It is a genuine connection that, much like, not in entirely the same way, but a human's nervous system, when it first comes online, exists in connection to another human being.
Yes.
And so we are hardwired to want regulation with another human being. Yeah. And so we're sort of doing that. We're not being parents, although I work with a lot of kids. So in some way, you're kind of being a surrogate parent temporarily. You are part of their growth process. You're capitalizing in a very genuine way on the nervous system's desire to regulate with another person who is safe and caring and, compassionate, all those good things.
Yeah. And in our culture, people don't feel safe in general right now, alone or with one another. So this really has to be, this becomes a safe place for people to actually unfold in this certain way that neurofeedback supports. And so the surround of that being the provider is just essential, I think, to the process. So, yeah.
And a lot of us are clinicians, but it doesn't have to be only therapists. That safe holding space can be other professionals with ethics and good training.
Yeah. The only thing you don't have to be, you could be an OT or you could be, some other, but it is important that you have enough awareness of the person as a whole person. That you don't just think that you're putting in a protocol, that you're going to help somebody with this one thing. And, and you're only asking them, did you do better with your focus this week? Because then there are all these other changes that are probably going on and the person is left alone with them. So, so it needs to be someone that has enough awareness to be aware of the person in their totality and to be tracking that and supporting the change with them. But it doesn't need to be a psychotherapist. But all the psychotherapists I have the privilege of working with are of the same ilk. They just feel so gratified and so committed to helping people and so privileged to be there that way that there's almost no stone they wouldn't, turn over to help someone move forward in their goals. These are just, genuine, caring professionals that are there. So
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you use 𝙭.
Gosh, Lars, we should have spoke about this sooner. I started 𝙭because that's what Seaburn used, and she said, go to this training and get this system. And I've used other systems. I have a couple other systems, and it's not that I didn't like them in a certain way. It's just I find my home with 𝙭, and one is because it allows something that I feel really strongly about is that the clinician, and we can help people be trained fairly easily to do this, so I don't want it to be intimidating. The clinician who's there noticing all these changes can actually manually adjust things for the benefit of their client with 𝙭 in a way that a lot of other systems you can't. And I just would not use a system that didn't allow me to do that because neurofeedback should never be a self-driving car. Engineers, I always tell people that whoever developed this software has brains, that I would never know how to do that. But I know how to sit in a room with a person and pay attention and listen to what they need and the changes that are happening. And I need to be able to make adjustments based on on that. So I would never work with a system that wasn't like that. It's the clinical community that's of the quality of, like, Leanne and you, the questions you're asking me. It's the fact that the software was developed in concert with clinicians like myself who could give feedback and still do about what they need and what's important. It's the kind of humane, all the courses that you record and the kind of humane way that you're in line with what I believe about, which is just supporting our common humanity in this time of struggle in the world to help people be the very best they can be. And so, and also, and I can't speak to the numbers on this, but I believe that 𝙬𝗓 gives the fastest. So in neurofeedback, we're mirroring back to the brain its own activity, and we're helping it use that information to change the EEG activity, which is why all these changes can happen. And 𝙬𝗓, I believe, gives the fastest feedback of doing that of any of the systems. So I'm like, I would just be ticking off things about why I want to use 𝙬𝗓, So
that's great. Thank you. Well, is there any other things that you feel like we didn't? I mean, there are a couple of questions there that we didn't get to, Ellen, and I just wonder if there are things in particular that for example, we didn't really talk about neuroplasticity, and
we kind of did, Lars. We just didn't use the big words, right?
Okay. all the better.
Yeah. Well, I will say, and you're gonna, I think, come soon. We haven't had an official exchange about it, but as I saw neurofeedback training kind of proliferating out in the world, and because I've used different systems and I interface with providers who are trained in different ways, and people would come into my mentoring groups, and it would be clear to me that they had not been taught to pay attention to some of the things that we've talked about. I really wanted the way that we work and the way that I've learned, like, I wanted a clinical presence out in the world that would reflect that, because I felt like 𝙬𝗓's been holding this ball all by itself all these years and done it so well, but clinicians just, and I think it's the purpose of this podcast, have a way of just speaking directly to each other sometimes that can kind of get each other's attention. So we created recently attuneneurofeedback.com, which is really everything that we're talking about that's happened on 𝙬𝗓, everything that we're talking about today. I hope you're going to come soon and be on. Leanne and I are starting to do Zooms on there. We've only just started because you can have a different system. And I know that when I teach classes for 𝙬𝗓, people come on there that have neurofeedback systems that's not 𝙬𝗓. So I know that 𝙬𝗓 is open to this too. Like, we want a shared conversation about the important values. And so people may make different choices about the system that they buy. But the fact that they would work in an attuned way that's consistent with the values of 𝙬𝗓 and the clinicians that work together seems really important. So I have the site attuneneurofeedback.com, which, people can visit if they want. And Lars, I hope you will come soon, and and maybe we could just have you come regularly and people could come when they want to talk about 𝙬𝗓. So I'm just excited about that site, and people can go and visit there and access that. And the purpose for that was to get out more training information about working in this attuned manner. And it was also to create a more integrated conversation between providers who may be working in different ways, so that there wouldn't be this kind of there would be more of a common sense of how to do this to serve people in general. So that's the purpose of that site. But outside of that, I think that I answered all your questions ahead. I made my notes, and I think we've hit everything.
That's great. Leanne, do you have anything else you want to add?
I think that the neurofeedback world, when I entered it almost 10 years ago, was really, and still it's pretty split. We're pretty far apart in some of the different camps. And I think of it like different camps, almost like different tribes. And I'm hoping that as more people come in, sites and places like 𝙬𝗓 and attuned neurofeedback can be a place where we have shared beliefs, but maybe, you do QEEG, maybe you do all these other things. The technology is not the important part necessarily. The way we approach the work and the respect and the humanity and the genuineness and desire to keep improving outcomes for clients, that's the part we all align and all come from the same camp. And then we just learn from each other. And I think Ellen's creation of the attuned neurofeedback has is in that service to try to bring us more together, because that's, I think, the thing our field is lacking the most. We have lots of great researchers, lots of great technology. We don't have a lot of us all coming together.
Right. And Eager's been doing courses with more diverse people too, though. So we're in we have common goal in that sense. Yes. So it's an exciting time to get to a place where we can kind of have our different approaches, but be in a common conversation. It's good.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ellen. Very grateful.
Thank you, Lars.